rich tapestry of speakers today to entertain and educate you. And our first one is a former BNP press officer and treasurer. He has an MA in economics, and his interests are unemployment and banking. And he may well be the last honest accountant left in the United Kingdom. Michael Newland!
Now, the nationalist movement has spent much too much time in the past having meetings like this, complaining about the antics of politicians, how they're destroying our country, and discussing the past, the Second World War. It always goes down well. This sort of talk goes down very well. It's very enjoyable. Everybody can sit there fuming about what politicians have done. Much too little attention has been paid to the future. What shape of British society will have, what the landscape will be, and what might be done politically, or what opportunities might present themselves politically in the future. Now, this talk is an exercise in amateur futurology. Now, you may ask, well, what is professional futurology? Well, there isn't such a thing, because nobody can be sure of the future. Anything could happen. But what presents itself as professional futurology is simply people who call themselves an institute and put out their ideas on glossy paper. It's all guesswork. But the area I'm going to talk about today, which is software and the future of jobs, is rather more determinable and predictable than many bits of futurology. But before we can begin to understand what's going to happen in the future, we need to understand the history of the economy and where we got now. Now, if you think some of this stuff is a bit dull and the school teaching stuff, think again, because it is far more important to our futures than many of the things that you could discuss. And if you find it boring, you shouldn't find it boring, because it's really poignant about our past and our futures. Now, you might think, well, where did we get to? These days we have things called cars, we fly to the moon, and all kinds of inventions keep coming along to increase productivity and do marvellous things that were thought impossible even a few decades ago. Parts can be replaced, jet aircraft go on holidays. Unthinkable. I mean, a couple of 200 or 300 years ago, much of what we have now, if anybody had suggested it, would have been thought it could only be produced by sorcery, and yet it's been produced by science. Today's talk is not about politicians' depredations. This is about the problems created, the opportunities here are because of human ingenuity and intelligence in finding ways of doing things which couldn't be done before, or doing things with less labour than they required. Now, this is very peculiar. The history of this is very, very peculiar. Now, human beings for 2,000 years ago were just as intelligent as they are now, and just as ingenious inventing ways of doing things, you would think. So one might suppose that, therefore, inventions which allowed us to increase output, like, say, the steam engine is a classic example, you might have thought from, say, the time of Christ, output would have gone up like that, output per person would have gone up steadily like that. Very peculiar thing, perhaps the most peculiar thing in the whole of history. Almost nothing happened until about 1800, 1750, 1800. The output of a man in 1800 was pretty much the same as it was hundreds of years before. People didn't see hardly any difference in their standard of living today than would compare with their great-great-grandfathers or well before them. Very often. So why did nothing happen? Well, all the ingredients were there. About 1780 or 1780 or so, people started making these marvellous inventions, steam engines, canals. They enabled output to go up quite steeply and immediately. There's a huge sea change took place in what human beings would do in the 18th century. Why did it not occur before? Well, absolutely weird. I mean, the year when Christ was born, human beings were just as intelligent and ingenious as they are now. Why did they not start discovering things like steam engines at that time, or apply them? Well, they did a little bit. The ancient Greeks experimented with steam now. They never really exploited it. And one of the interesting things for historians to discuss is why the Industrial Revolution didn't happen for another 1800 years. And there are lots of answers given to that. And one of them is that the social and political structure didn't encourage independent thinking. You've got oppressive kings and emperors and oppressive church. Also, there wasn't a legal system that enabled contract to be enforced. Maybe the raw materials weren't quite easily available. All kinds of reasons can be given for this. Why people didn't invent the steam engine and start applying it and running. Why weren't the Romans running steam engines? Another answer is slavery. Why bother? You can get cheap slaves. Go invade a few countries, grab some slaves. Why do you need a steam engine? You just get some slaves and get them to do the work. Whatever the reasons are, and they're complex, this huge sea change in humanity took place in the 18th century in this country. And maybe coal was the answer, easily available cheap coal. Whatever it was, this gigantic sea change, the most remarkable thing in the history of mankind, between 1780 and 1800. In fact, by 1750, people already began to feel the increase in the standard of living because of inventions in this country. One of the cries of London around 1750 was no popery and no clogs. What they meant by that was that abroad people were much poorer, and the poorer people had to wear wooden shoes, yet they had leather shoes, who were rather better off. There was an era of prosperity already by 1750 in this country. So then we had this great sea change, known as the Industrial Revolution. And when it started, marvellous inventions, spinning jennies and machines to till the soil, which could be done much more efficiently than with labour power. These things came along, and at first people thought this was a little burst of unexpected inventiveness which would soon die out. And it didn't. Things have fed up on each other for about 200 years, output going up and up, more and more things became technically possible. Absolutely marvellous and miraculous. Nothing like one would expect with a gradual increase in output over say 2,000 years. Now, this system of producing things from that point onwards, from the 18th century onwards, has been based on capitalism. Now, that doesn't mean men in top hats oppressing the workers. What capitalism actually means is you start using machinery to help people to do jobs. A very simple example of that is if you want a man to drill a hole in a wall, you used to do it by getting him to use a hand drill. Now you buy him a drill. You buy him an electric drill, or maybe 2 or 3 electric drills, and he drills the holes much more efficiently. You put together capital. The capital referred to in the capitalists, the people who own the drill. They're put together with the labour, and you can produce a lot more than the man on his own. Now there are 2 huge problems with capitalism, and the first is collusion. As Adam Smith said in the 18th century, whenever a group of businessmen get together, they start conspiring against the public to increase their profits. Now that's, of course, what we saw with the banking system, isn't it, after the crash in 2008. They simply had no concern for social welfare or the welfare of society. They were simply concerned with getting a fast buck out of that. Now that's not today's. That problem with capitalism collusion, is, which of course the left complain about, and we complain about, Marxists complain about, that's not what we're talking about today. What we're talking about with capitalism today is the other aspect of it. Its ability to inspire inventiveness, because each capitalist wants to undercut his rivals and produce goods cheaper. So the capitalists encourage people to invent new methods of doing things which enable them to be done with less labour. The core of it is how much labour you put in. Now, let me introduce to you. If you think this is boring, don't think it's boring, it's so important. This is called the Cobb-Douglas production function. And we're not going to do any maths today. I'm only writing it up on the board because it's easy to understand these things if you've got somebody talking and somebody in a visual representation at the same time. What this is actually telling you is that if you put together some capital and some labour, that's C and L there, you get a certain amount of output out of it in terms of goods that you can consume. How much you get depends on technological inventiveness, which is the K there. And that has gone up over the last 200 years. This is called the Cobb-Douglas production function. It was actually invented in the 1930s by Senator Douglas. He was an American senator and a mathematician called Cobb. And they came up with this very simple exposition of how labour and capital are put together and how you get output out of them. Now, a very important factor to understand about this is that how much capital do you put into an amount of labour? Because capital costs a lot of money to produce. You use a lot of capital or a little bit of capital with a given amount of labour. The capitalist has to make that decision, and he has to make it so that he balances up how much he's spending out on direct labour on the shop floor and how much he's spending out on capital goods for that labour to work with. He has to balance that out, and that balance can change with technical inventions. If you have any questions on this as we go, now this is difficult stuff, it's not easy to understand at first. If you have any questions, please ask them. Now, what happens is, as new inventions come along, people find that they can use less labour on the shop floor and more capital and still do it efficiently. But the total amount of labour used is the two things, because capital is produced out of labour. You're going to use an electric drill for your man to work with. Somebody has to put some labour in to make the electric drill. So you've got a total amount of labour in those two things. There's a labour content in the capital, and there's a direct labour on the shop floor. And you aim to reduce the total amount of labour in the two, so you can produce your goods cheaper. Now the balance between those two, the capitalist has to decide that. He's got to do some neat calculations or do it by intuition. And as time has gone on, people have used more and more capital with a given amount of labour, because the productivity of capital was enabled to be produced by capital goods becoming more exotic. For instance, instead of having a system of chains and pulling things through a production line, you have robots in the car factory, or semi-robots helping the man along to do his job. So this as time goes on, the amount of capital used increases all the time compared to the amount of labour. Now, the whole point is to reduce the total amount of labour. Otherwise, there wouldn't be any point in doing this, would there? Because that's the way you get your goods cheaper and get a competitive advantage. Now, that means that for a given volume of goods you're producing, if you use less labour in total, that means people are shoved out of work, which is, of course, what famously happened at the time of the Industrial Revolution. It's caused machine breaking. Why were they breaking the machines? Because the machines were putting them out of work. Less labour was needed. Now, the answer to that, if anybody who studied economics knows that the standard answer to this problem of people being put out of work by technical innovation is called the lump of labour fallacy. What it says is, well, it doesn't really matter if people are put out of work in one direction by technology, because human wants are bottomless, and therefore something will be found that they can do which people want. Now, there's a bit of a fallacy built in. The lump of labour fallacy is in principle true. If you have spare labour, you don't need so many people in the car plant, you've got spare labour, they can go and do something else. That's true in principle. The fallacy in the lump of labour fallacy, because there is a fallacy in it, is it doesn't tell you how much they're going to be paid in these new alternative occupations. If people are thrown out of well-paid jobs in factories, what are they going to do? How much are they going to be paid to weed people's gardens or so? It may not even be enough to live on. We already have partly a society where many people working jobs in this country only reach subsistence level because they're topped up with tax payments. So that you can't call a job that doesn't pay even subsistence a job in any meaningful sense. And yet, as far as the lump of labour fallacy is concerned, if somebody's chucked out of the car plant because the robots are introduced, and the only work they can get pays £1 a week, they've still got a job. It's just £1 a week job. Well, that's a very unrealistic way of looking at things. Now, what are all these people who are being chucked out of jobs going to do? Well, I don't know whether you ever read Rise to Canada. There's a remarkable book about agriculture in the late 19th century in Oxfordshire. And the agricultural labourers were very poor. A large part of their income came from having a little patch of land, which they kept a pig on and grew vegetables. And that provided a substantial amount of their income. But people these days don't have the abilities to be thrown out of car plants or any other form of modern industrial activity. They don't have a cabbage patch they can work on, and they can't produce their own incomes. They rely on employment. These days, how many people here could grow their own food? Anybody here know how to grow their own food? Few people. Yeah, very small amount of people here could grow their own food if they had a bit of land to do it on. But in general, people can only make a living if they're employed by something else. They're employed by something else.
Right, hold the microphone in front of it. We can't hear
okay,
you.
sorry, I can't hear how loud it is down there.
Okay,
I'll have it near. Yeah. Now around since computers were invented and started being used in is that loud enough, Richard? Yep. Yeah. Since the 1960s, when computers came into use, software came into use with mainframe computers. Of course, everybody has been aware that computers could put people out of work. And there's been a certain amount of discussion on this, but far less than one might expect. In fact, in 1995, somebody called Jeremy Rifkin published a book called The End of Work, which is all about how the availability of jobs would be decimated by software. And it achieved a little splurge of interest, and then that died out. And the reason it died out, interest died, is because at the time we were entering into an artificial boom created by banking, which meant that lots of people money was splashing around, people had things to do, and this obscured the underlying fact that jobs are disappearing. In fact, in the 10 years between 2000 and 2010, 1 million secretaries disappeared in the United States. Now, it's a big country, but still, it's a lot of people, 1 million in just one small occupation. So Rifkin's book did achieve a little splash, and then everything went quiet for quite a long time. And then last year, we started a renewed discussion on the effects of software as a result, partly of the Google car, which has been developed in America, the robotic car. And the initial reaction to the robotic car was what we've often heard in the past, it'll never work. This is the idea that new technologies come along well. It's very interesting, but they'll never make it work. There's nothing new about that. George Gershwin wrote a witty song in 1937 about it, with lines about They All Laugh. The song's called They All Laugh. There's lots of things about people said Marconi and his wireless was a phony, and Wilbur and his brother said that man could fly. That's a joke. And also that Ford and his Lizzie kept the laughers busy. Ford and his Lizzie was Ford and it was Henry Ford, and the first mass-produced car, the Tin Lizzie of the Model T Ford. So laughing at technology and thinking it'll never work is nothing new. Last year we had a slight outbreak of this over the Google car. These cars are coming. They're already being introduced in Milton Keynes shortly. That alone, before long, is going to do a lot of people out of jobs. Why would you have a cab driver running around London when you can get in a robotic car, put your car in the slot, it'll take you where you want to go? That's coming, and it won't be too long either. Now, the optimists about the future of jobs like to point to the 19th century, and they say, well, huge numbers of people were thrown off the land by agricultural machinery, but they soon found jobs elsewhere, and so they did. There were huge upsets and misery, but people did find other jobs. What happened in the first industrial revolution 200 years ago is that one labour-intensive economy was exchanged for another, and it was a factory-based intensive labour economy. People left the land, they went into factories on a huge scale. And so the optimists just vaguely say, well, the same thing will happen again. People will find new jobs. What they don't mention about, one of the things they don't mention about the 19th century is that one of the sources of sucking up labour chucked off the land was domestic service, the new middle class. They never mention that, do they? Huge amounts of people went into domestic service and became what were called slavies. I mean, for instance, one of my ancestors in the first half of the 19th century, he was an excise man, posted all over the country, fairly low down in the excise. Everywhere he went, he had a servant. He was middle class, every day he had a servant, a 12 or 14-year-old girl. Sort of girls who a generation before would have been on the farm picking up eggs or doing a bit of weeding. So huge amounts of labour were pushed into domestic service and also into the new factories. But where are the sources of replacing jobs which are disappearing in the wake of increasingly sophisticated software? I mean, the government is not going to take on a lot of new people. After the war, the government acted as an employer of last resort. That's gone. The government is going to cut the number of people that's employed. Manufacturing is certainly reducing its need for labour, so services. There's no obvious source of new mass employment for people displaced by software. And the pace of change and displacement of labour is hotting up. Now, you may not have read that there's a Commons committee called the Digital Committee or something like that. It looks into this issue. And just a few days ago, they announced that they expected in the next 2 decades 30% of the existing jobs to disappear as a result of software. Well, what was their answer to that? Their answer was the answer that politicians have given to this problem for the last 30 years. Retraining. But retraining for what? What are they going to retrain for? There isn't any obvious source to retrain very large numbers of people, certainly not 30% of the workforce. Some people put it higher. One Chinese think tank thought 50% of jobs would disappear. Jeremy Rifkin, in his book, thought 70% of current jobs could be obviated by machinery or software. Robotic cars, you don't need meter readers anymore with smart meters. And also, very important, this is not just the kind of people who are being displaced now are not just the unskilled working class. A lot of middle class jobs are going to be displaced. For instance, medical software is now said to be capable of diagnosing disease better than doctors can. They're more efficient and more reliable. You may have a doctor who oversees it, of course. And it's the same as with the law and many other middle class occupations. Increasingly, software is going to get rid of a lot of jobs at all levels of society. In fact, I think Paul Craig Roberts, who Richard likes to mention in his speeches, Paul Craig Roberts said recently that it was something like a quarter of, was it 30-40% of young Americans in their 20s are still living with their families because they can't get well-paid jobs to afford to live anywhere else. The future of this is absolutely frightening in terms of this displacement of labour with nowhere to go. Now, I want to emphasise that the software that's coming along enables machines to do things which previously humans could only do, in which one might think that you needed a conscious being like a human being to operate. I mean, one might have thought 40 years ago that to operate a car, you needed a conscious being, and yet, in fact, you don't. A piece of glorified clockwork called software can actually run cars quite efficiently, already drive trains. So the software that's coming along is not human, it's not conscious. And I just want to say a few words on this, an aside on this, because there's a film recently made about Alan Turing, who was a pioneer of computers. The film was made for all the wrong reasons, but no matter, it was about Alan Turing. And Alan Turing had something which is known as the Turing test. What it meant is that you can tell whether something's, if somebody could invent a computer that was conscious, you'll be able to test it by questioning it and get some sense of whether it was a human, whether it was in any sense resembling a human in its conscious abilities. It's known as the Turing test, and it may well be possible to get now developed software which can convince people that you're talking to a human, but these machines are not in any sense conscious beings. I just wanted to make a slide on that because it's extremely interesting, because one of the huge problems in science is how does consciousness come about? And 40 years ago, people thought it was just a glorified big mechanical computer. You make a big enough computer, you'll have a conscious being. Well, it turns out that doesn't seem to be possible. Consciousness is something else, and that raises all kinds of issues to do with quantum physics, and whether physical reality is actually an emanation of consciousness rather than the other way around. So I just put an aside on this because it's an extremely interesting area. Now, now what happens if that's the jobs, if that block there is the economy, we've got lots of people working in, they're all happy, they've all got jobs, and these people get shoved out. They go down the drain to the job centre there. Down they go to the job centre there, where they're told they can retrain, goodness knows for what, and they're all looking miserable down there. Now, what are these guys going to do? This economy here is not going to take them on. Probably, maybe a few of them, but most of them are not going to be taken on. And it's huge numbers, going to be huge numbers of people in the future, not the sort of trickle of people being displaced who can find other occupations. Well, what are these guys going to do? They don't own cabbage patches, they can't grow their own food, they rely on somebody else's employment. Now, it may be that the people in jobs, who are now doing very well indeed, choose to pay these guys and take a few of them on in a private capacity, maybe to do their gardening or something like that. I get pathetic little notes put through the door in the last few years from people who are looking for little scraps of miserable work. Can you speak up for 2 hours? Speak up? Well, can you turn the volume up a bit? Because I'm shouting already in this microphone. What? Sorry?
It's not on.
I think it is on. You need. It's a strange microphone. You need to speak almost directly into it.
All right, I'll speak to it.
Is that going?
Well, normally you can speak that distance from a microphone. No, all right, I'll speak right into the mic. Is that okay? Can you hear that? Yeah. Okay. Well, these guys here, those who are already in jobs, they may well be willing to employ a few of these guys in there to do their gardening, or maybe as domestic servants. But it's very difficult to see how you can suck up the sheer amount of people who are being displaced by software and will be displaced in the future. So one answer to this was given by Jeremy Rifkin in his book. Maybe the only answer is the third sector, charity work. But the numbers are so great. Numbers are so great. How can you absorb millions of people into charity work? It requires organisation on a huge scale. And politicians like, as Cameron did recently, like to gaily talk about the unemployed being sent off to cook food for old age pensioners or paint their houses. The fact they can talk like that just shows how illiterate they are in the realities of doing things and the skills involved. If you just send out any old person to a job centre and told them go to this address and cook food for this old age pensioner, there'd be mass food poisoning, and the pensioner would probably refuse to eat the dreadful food. It's just not as easy to displace, it's not as easy to use people in the charitable sector on a large scale as it looks, particularly people who are not motivated. I mean, if you've got no job or a future prospect of a job, and nobody's offering you any extra money for working, why would you bother? People, if there's one thing we've learned about economics in the last 100 years, is that people need incentives. And that was the fatal flaw in communism. It relied on goodwill and human nature, and not financial incentives. So I can't see that we can use people in the charity sector on a sufficient scale to suck them up for where they're going to be displaced in the mainstream economy. So what are they going to do? Well, it may be that we have very large numbers of people who never work, who are given small dole handouts, and also probably a few treats, perhaps free internet access, so to keep them quiet, give them bread and circuses. Is this a life of pleasure or is it a life of hell? You're going to have a lot of people who after a while are extremely frustrated looking through the windows of offices of people who are doing extremely well, and they're shut out of that economy on a huge scale. In fact, Rifkin in his book notes a psychologist in the 1980s who observed that people who are long-term unemployed had a similar pathology to those who'd been bereaved. It is a bereavement, having nothing in your life, no purpose in your life. Huge numbers. Now, are there any answers to this? Well, this problem of human ingenuity is not to do with penal politicians just for once, it's to do with human inventiveness, which is not going to stop. So there's no answer in saying we're going to hold back the tide of inventiveness, that's not possible. But perhaps one answer is, at least, don't bring in more surplus labour. Politicians at the moment, their idea of running the economy is based on a labour-intensive economy which used to exist. It's absolutely bizarre. They're planning for the world of the past, not the world of the future. So they keep talking about the need for more labour and bringing in vast numbers of immigrants, and we don't need more labour. We need less labour. So one answer is to reduce the amount of labour. Another answer is job sharing. But the amount of work that people are going to get, many of them, is so slight it's hardly worth doing. Now, there is another possible route by which this problem might be partly resolved, and that comes about with, it's identified with an economist called Rifkin, who pointed out something very curious about this equation here. He talked about this production equation. Just find it. very curious thing about this. How much output you can get from the economy depends entirely on how much labour you've got. Because you either need labour on the shop floor or you need labour to produce the capital goods. Somebody has to work in the factory producing the electric drills and the robots. But the only input you need to produce outputs is labour. Everything else is taken for granted. That's a pretty odd assumption, that, because, of course, energy is an input into this process, which isn't mentioned in this equation. What happens if we run short of energy? I mean, oil prices have fallen recently, but overall it's becoming increasingly difficult to obtain energy. The cost of extracting it is going up compared with the amount you get. It may come, of course, somebody may come along with some marvellous invention like fusion, but at the moment there are quite a few things which may intervene to stop this convenient assumption that you don't need to think about anything but the amount of labour content. So it really, no one knows quite what will happen. It's absolutely certain that huge numbers of people are going to be displaced from the economy in a way they never were by the Industrial Revolution. And what are we going to do with them, and what political opportunities will this create? You're going to have a lot of people who are very discontented with the way things are going, particularly if they see further immigration taking away the very few jobs that are available. So we should be discussing these issues in the future, rather than merely complaining about what politicians are doing now. Now, maybe I've raced through that too quickly, but I thought, because it's complicated stuff, leave plenty of time for questions if you have any.
Right, we've got a few time for questions. Any questions?
Yeah, I sort of have a few comments. The software and increasing mechanisation of jobs, these jobs which are being lost, they're not exactly very dignified. I mean, we're talking things like Tesco checkout swipers and ordering McDonald's, where McDonald's are now bringing in touchscreens to place orders. These aren't very humanising, dignified jobs with extensive career paths. These are, for all intents and purposes, sort of just dead-end, human cog jobs. And if you look at the people who are actually doing these jobs, they're normally not native indigenous British. They're unskilled labourers who have decided that an unskilled labour job in England is a better bet than an unskilled labour job in, say southern India or something like that. I mean, I come from a sort of lower middle class English background, and I've taken up a manual labour job, and I work with a number of native British people, and the manual labour we do is relatively skilled. It's not something which you can easily replace with a machine, because it requires a level of sort of human ingenuity and interaction. And so those jobs are still around, and in order to preserve them, it would just take a degree of sort of economic protectionism, which we've since dispensed with exporting jobs to overseas. So there's a number of different angles.
Well, first of all, yes, of course, I mentioned in my talk that people are being brought in. There aren't enough jobs and people are being brought into doing them instead of our own people doing it. But the fact is, you say working on a Tesco checkout is a menial job. It is. But at the same time, it is a job. If people aren't producing anything, you've still got to support them on the expense of somebody else's taxation. So better a job than no job. The first thing is that the second thing about what you're saying is I think you're underrating the ability of software to replace quite sophisticated human activities which you would regard as skilled. That's the whole point. In fact, one view of this put forward by one of these think tanks is that the software revolution is going to replace far more skilled middle class people than it is unskilled working class people. So don't be too confident that you're safe if you're doing skilled
I think
work.
that's very optimistic, because I work in construction and we're running around on cranes which are about 25, 30 years old. So if there's a technological miracle sort of waiting to happen, I think it's going to be a very long time before we actually see it.
Well, the experience of in development of methods of doing things has been far faster than one might expect. It's speeding up all the time. But we'll only know in the future. This is why I said this is an exercise of amateur futurology, because nobody can be certain of the future. But I'm more pessimistic about that than you are.
Two more questions.
Sorry, I'm a software engineer by trade. So what you're describing really is nothing more than screwdrivers or spanners or wrenches. Like in our trade, we have design plans, Saga or MVCS or something. The economy grows there and it evolves, and the different trades, they come up with different solutions to common problems. I don't think that means that people are necessarily doing bad jobs. I mean, I'm not. So.
Well, we'll only know in the future. But the fact is, since the 1970s, the amount of employment has declined. A lot of what are called jobs now are semi-jobs, they're pretend jobs. A lot of people had full-time jobs in the 70s. They now might have 0-hour contracts. The fact is, we're already feeling the effects. We haven't managed to replace all the jobs that existed 30 years ago. That's a fact.
Okay, last question.
Right, I wonder if you could explain to someone who doesn't really understand economics very well. Japan's a country which hasn't been replacing the the declining population of immigrants, and it's also one which is quick to adopt new technologies. But people say it's it's an economic crisis at the moment. What do you think about Japan? Is it really as bad as people say?
Well, that's a separate subject. The ups and downs of the economy due to a lack of demand, whether people are spending their money or not, that goes up and down. That's a completely separate issue from the issue of overall productivity and the need for labour over the long term. I mean, you can have an economy with very rapidly growing productivity, putting people out of work, but at the same time, you can have a lack of demand or excess demand for a while, which hides the effects of the underlying economic forces. And I mentioned that in connection with Jeremy Rifkin's book and the discussion in 1990, that everything went quiet about software and displacement of jobs because it was masked by an artificial economic boom. And what's happening in Japan is a long-term depression, which is a financial depression. People aren't spending enough money. That's quite separate from the underlying productivity question.
Right, thank you very much. We nothing left to lose, everything to gain. Now, I spent several years at the LSE, the London School of Economics, and I heard more common sense in that 40-minute talk than I heard in all my years there. Michael Newland.